So if you recall, where we finished off last time was walking through the structure and functionality of the Zippy microservice. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the source code of the Zippy microservice, starting with the implementation of the Zippy quote repository, which is where we're going to define some of the interfaces that are used to access the database, the Zippy quotes database. And we're also going to talk about the multi-query repository. In fact, that's going to be the bulk of our focus here, because that's where we hand wrote a custom SQL query, because you can't quite get the features you want out of the box using Spring's data API. So let's go ahead and take a look at that implementation, starting with the Zippy quote repository. So here we are in the Zippy package, the Zippy folder, in the microservices portion of the EX4 project. And we're going to start by taking a look at Zippy quote repository. So here's the Zippy quote repository interface. You can see it extends the Java JPA repository, which comes out of the box. And that has a mapping of quotes, where that's the contents in the portion of the database. And it's going to be essentially indexed by integer, which is the quote ID. And then we're also going to extend multi-query repository, which we'll talk about here shortly. Now, when you extend JPA repository, you get a bunch of methods for free. You get methods like find all, or find by ID, or find all by ID, and so on and so forth. So those are things that are going to come along for the ride, and we'll see how those are used in the second part of this lesson when we talk about the Zippy service implementation that calls those methods. We're also going to define a method here called find by quote containing ignore case. And what that will do is it'll find all the rows in the database that contain this string query in a case-insensitive way. And it returns a list of quote objects that match that query. Now, you'll see here that this is using the Spring Data API, so we don't actually have to write any code for this. This comes along for the ride, and if you go back and take a look at the videos that talked about how things work, you'll see what the query looks like under the hood for doing that. So that's the Zippy quote repository. Now, a couple other things I want to point out, because we really have to talk about that. Let's go take a look at quote over here. So here's the quote class. And this class stores quotes. Now, before, when we looked at this in the context of the handy microservice, we only cared about the parts here that said public class quote, which is the name of a class, public integer ID, which is the quote ID. Each quote has a unique ID, and public string quote, which is just the quote itself. That's all we cared about before, because we were only doing non-persistent programming with an in-memory list of quote strings. Now, however, we're actually going to be using the cool features in the Java persistence architecture in order to be able to store instances of quote in a database. And so now we have to do some extra stuff. So if you take a look, you can see what all these annotations mean. I gave you little descriptions, but essentially value says this is going to be something that's a value object, and a value indicates that the fields are supposed to be immutable. They're only initialized by the class constructor. So this is important in order to be able to make sure that we don't have to worry about things changing out from underneath us. There's some other stuff about various types of constructors that are automatically generated. The entity annotation down here marks this as a JPA entity, which indicates that the class will be mapped to a table in an SQL database, and its fields are mapped to the columns of that table. So each instance, each row will be an instance of quote, and each row has the columns, in this case the ID and quote columns. And this is very common for object-relational mapping. And then the final annotation here, which is this table annotation, just says that this is going to be a table in a database with which instances of these entities are associated. And the name here just says that's the name we want to make for the database table. By default, it would be called quote with lowercase UOTE. We're just going to give it uppercase. It doesn't really matter, just to have some fun. And then there's a couple more things that we have as annotations in the class itself for its fields. And the first one is this @ID annotation, and that says that this field is the primary key in the table for this entity. And generated value means that these primary keys will be automatically created when we insert the items into the table. And they're just basically going to go, I think, from 0 to n-1, or maybe it's 1 to n. I always forget which one it does. And then finally, we have the value of the quote. And the value here is going to be this quote string. And we're going to annotate it to be a column named quote. And that enables us to search for it by its quote item. And then we say that this column can't contain null values, therefore you have to provide a quote, which makes sense because it's a database of quotes. So those are the annotations that we have to provide. And you get very accustomed to seeing JPA code with annotations like this for the entity items, the classes that serve the role as entities. So that's what we use here as the first parameter to the JPA repository. The next thing I'm going to take a look at is this multi-query repository. And we do this because, once again, there are certain types of queries that are not satisfiable or automatically generatable by using Spring's data API. And this is an example of one of them. So what this is going to do is it's going to be used to find a list of all the quote objects in the database that contain all of the queries that we pass in this list of queries in a case-insensitive way, which you just can't do with the Spring Data API out of the box, probably for good reason. And so we write this method, and I tried to kind of conform to the way the data API works if it were to support this. So we say find all, which means we want to get back a list, by quote, so we're looking at the quotes, containing ignore case all in. So that's kind of describing it. Everything has to be in there, and we want to see if it's contained. So we can't actually do this with Spring Data API. So instead, we're going to have to make ourselves a multi-query repository impl, and this uses the repository implementation pattern, and that particular pattern is baked into Spring. And so it knows when it sees multi-query repository impl, that implements the multi-query repository interface. So this is where it's going to go to create the implementation for that particular interface. And this is the way you do this manually. So this is lots of fun. So we have something here that's called the Entity Manager, which is going to be a bean that will be associated with the database in order to perform the CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete operations to do stuff and query the database. And then here is the method find all by quote containing ignore case all in, where we give it a list of strings. And a lot of this stuff is kind of boilerplate code, but it's important to understand what it does because otherwise you can't make any sense out of this. So the first thing we do is we take our entity manager, this guy up here, and we say entity manager, please make me a criteria builder. So that's a little factory method. And then we say, hey, criteria builder, please create me a query object, which is going to query items of type quote. Of course, we know what quote is. We saw quote over there. That's the entity type. And then we take our criteria query, and we say we want to create a root object that will specify the entity to query. And again, we want to query the quote class. And now we're starting to get even further down here, and we say, hey, criteria builder, please make me an expression object that represents the lowercase quote column. So this is the quote column in the quote entity. And we're going to use this in order to be able to do some expressions in a moment. And then the final two things we do here are methods that I wrote. The first one is going to make a predicate that will AND all the queries. Here's the queries parameter, this guy. It's going to AND all the queries together using the criteria builder and the quote expression. And we'll see what that's going to do in a second. So we're going to get back a predicate. And then we're going to use that predicate to query the table to give back the results that might match, if any. So let's go take a look at get predicate. So here's get predicate. It takes the list of queries, the criteria builder, and the quote expression, which, if you recall, is what's going to identify the columns. And now we have some really fun Java Streams code. We had a really good time back in the day helping to write this code with my good friend ChatGPT to make it nice and clean. So we take the list of queries, turn it into a stream of queries. We map each query to lowercase. And then what we're going to do is we're going to encode those queries into a so-called like predicate that's going to match the quote column of a quote entity or a quote object in the database. So we say CriteriaBuilder like, give it the quote expression that we have, which is the column that we're looking for, the quote column. And then we're going to say we want it to be like this query. So that's going to end up generating this expression. It's going to have a stream of predicates now. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use the reduce terminal operation to reduce this list of predicates, which was what we got here, or stream of predicates. Should really say stream of predicates, into a single conjunctive and predicate. So that's going to join those things together as and. So now we're going to end up with this essentially this expression, which is a predicate, which will and together all the queries in the list of query strings. So that's what's going to get returned here. So we have an and predicate, and then we're going to pass that to get query results. Now this is where we're finally going to query the database at long last, after everything else we've done. So what we do is we say, hey, Entity Manager, please make a query that's going to make the query criteria be this and predicate. So create a query against the database table using this and predicate with the where clause. So that's the part of the query that's the where, and then it's this gobbledygook that's the and predicate for this stuff. So at long last, we then take that and we say, please execute this query and return the list of matching quote objects, if there are any. There will be because of the way we're going to query, but there might not be. So we're going to get back a list of quotes that match that query. So very, very fun, very interesting. I wrote this code the way I did so it would be easy to look at it, because for an upcoming assignment, you're going to have to do something like this. And so it'll help to use this as a model in order to see how to write that code. So that's essentially the multi-query repository implementation of find all by quote containing ignore case all in, which you don't manage to get out of the box. So that's the walkthrough of the Zippy quote repository portion of our microservice. And you can see how a lot of this stuff came out of the box because we used the Spring Data API, but for the parts where we couldn't quite get the Spring Data API, we had to implement a custom SQL query ourselves.